Okie dokie, here we are on our final lesson for Unit 5 that I will be producing this year. Let's talk about how the environment affects phenotype. So, there is a concept called phenotypic plasticity. That is, different individuals could have the exact same genotype for a trait, but based on their environment and that they grow up in, that they're living in, that can affect how that genotype is expressed. And so, for a particular genotype, you can actually have a range of different phenotypes. There's a strong interaction, especially for certain genes, between the environment you're in and the actual traits that you express. So, here's an example. You can have a particular plant, and if you grow it in an environment with a lot of CO2, it will develop stomata, but only at a lower density. However, if you grow that same plant in an environment with low concentrations of CO2, they still have the same genes, but in response to the environmental conditions, it will end up growing more stomata on the underside of the leaves to make sure it can absorb insufficient CO2. Let's look at this in a number of different traits. So here, let's look at human height and weight. You probably have been able to see that people have different heights based on what they inherit from their parents. So if you have tall parents, there's a higher chance you yourself might be tall. Height is a polygenic trait. That means multiple genes contribute to that trait. And in the case of height, so far we have identified over 108 genes that play a role in the height a person will develop. However, um, the variation that you see in height only is accounted for by about 40% by these different genotypes of these genes. Instead, environment plays a very big role in the phenotype of how tall a person can grow, especially based on the nutrition that they receive during childhood and while they're growing, and their health at the same time. So while genotype frequencies, the amount of alleles we have for very tall versus very short individuals have not changed significantly over the past 100 years, the height of individuals has actually changed. So the average height of humans in this graph is shown based on the year they were born. This goes from people born in 1896 all the way to people born in 1996. And this is an average for the whole planet. You'll notice that the average height has grown for males by what looks like a good 10 centimeters almost. And in females, it's grown by about 8 centimeters. This isn't because the gene frequencies have changed. This is because the nutrition has been better for most people. They have plenty of food to eat. Healthcare has improved. And so people have been able to reach their full potential for height based on their genes. Weight is another polygenic trait. There have been between 400 and 1,000 genes that seem to play a role in weight. Yet you'll see people, you can see this if you look at people with identical DNA like twins that live in different conditions. They will have different weights, not based on their genotypes, but based on their lifestyle choices like diet, exercise levels, etc. There's also other traits in other species. So, for example, the really big example of this is hydrangea flowers. Their flowers will be different colors depending on the soil pH. So, if the pH of the soil is very acidic, they will tend to have blue flowers. If the pH of the soil is in this very narrow range between like 5.5 and 6.5, they'll have purple flowers. And if the pH is above that, then they'll have pink flowers. This also depends on whether there's aluminum in the soil. So, why is this? And this is completely independent of genotype. You could take the same plant, you could have it grown in acidic soil, and then you could repot it into less acidic soil, and the flower color would change, even though the genotype of the plant didn't change. This is because the pH of the soil affects how much aluminum is available in the soil, and when the plants take in aluminum, that affects the color of the pigment. So the pigment is being produced as the same, but the environment affects how that is expressed in the plant itself. So here is just a little more detail if you want to see what ends up happening if there's aluminum in the soil. Um, It is in a different chemical form, and it can interact with the pigment molecules. These are the pigment molecules here. They're normally pink when there's no aluminum associated with them. When there is aluminum associated with them, then they will turn more blue. And when it's a half and half mix of associated with aluminum and then half of the pigment is not associated with aluminum, you'll see a mix between blue and pink, which makes the flowers purple. If you're interested in learning more details about this, you can either go to the website linked here, or you can pause the video here and read what's in the diagram. There's also seasonal fur color. So if animals live in the Arctic, there's usually a very dramatic change in their environment when it is winter. There's usually going to be areas are going to be covered with snow. And so in order to camouflage to avoid predators or to avoid being spotted by their prey, these organisms will change their coat color. So they'll be white in the winter and there'll be various shades of brown or gray in the summer. Another thing that changes is you might notice that the animals look fluffier in the winter when they have the white fur coat, and that's because kind of the texture of their fur changes as well in order to help them insulate. So, what ends up causing this is while organisms have genes for melanin and where melanin is produced and how much melanin is produced, that's going to affect fur color. But depending on how much daylight they're receiving, that's going to affect the genes for melanin production, and it's going to either turn them on or turn them off. If there is melanin that's present in the fur, they'll have the darker color. If there's no melanin being produced to put in the fur, then they'll have a lighter color. A very interesting case is we talk about male and female and how that's genetically determined. We talked about that in class in animals like mammals as well as birds. We talked about X and Y chromosomes and Z and W chromosomes. But in other animals, like a lot of reptiles, which includes most turtles, all crocodile and alligators, some lizards, and even some fish, they don't have their gender determined by their genotype. Instead, it's determined by temperature. So this is called temperature dependent sex determination. And this is different in different species. But what ends up happening is let's say that you are a turtle embryo and you're developing. Well, at a certain point in development, you have the potential to become either male or female, depending on the temperature that's expressed or the temperature of the environment that you're in. You're either going to express this one gene which produces a protein called aromatase. And if that happens, you're going to produce more female sex hormones, which means that your tissue that could end up becoming either an ovary or a testis will end up developing into an ovary, and then you'll develop into a female turtle. If the temperature is different, if it's in this case for turtles lower, then that aromatase is not produced, which means that you're going to produce less female sex hormones, more male sex hormones, and that tissue will develop into a testis instead. Now, this temperature determination can be different in different species. So, for example, this graph is showing the proportion of males you have at different temperatures. And this shows that colder temperatures for turtles will tend to produce more males, and hotter temperatures will tend to produce more females. This is in part in B of this graph. That's a tuatara, which is distantly related to lizards. And you'll see that they're the opposite. At lower temperatures, they produce mostly females. At higher temperatures, they produce mostly males. And then crocodilians, like crocodiles and alligators, are a little different when there are at either very low or very high temperatures. They'll produce mostly females, but at medium temperatures, they'll produce mostly males. Then there's also melanin production in humans. So think of people's skin color. They have a natural skin tone, which, if you look at the skin that's not exposed to the sun, can be dark or light. This is because of the amount of melanin that they produce. And there are genes that control that. So naturally, some people will produce more melanin in their skin, have darker pigment. Some people will produce less melanin in their skin and have lighter colored skin. But for most people, when they're exposed to ultraviolet radiation, like in sunlight, that's going to change their melanin production. That's how people get a tan. So, what ends up happening is UV radiation damages DNA. So, when skin cells detect this DNA damage due to UV radiation, that's going to activate some cell cycle proteins. That's also going to activate some other proteins that will then produce chemicals that will promote the production of melanin, the transcription of the genes for melanin production in cells called melanocytes, which produce melanin, and that's going to add more pigment to those cells, which means they're going to end up causing a darker tone in the skin cells. That is because then that melanin will protect the skin cells from more UV radiation damage, which will hopefully prevent skin cancer. And then yeast are a type of fungi. They're a little weird. They tend to live most of their lifespan as haploid cells, but they can end up producing diploid cells, which can then undergo meiosis. So yeast are single-celled fungi. They can reproduce either sexually or asexually. If they're reproducing asexually, then they're just producing new haploid cells. If they choose to reproduce sexually, then they can combine with a cell of a different mating type, and the mating types are either A or alpha. You don't need to know a whole lot more detail about that. There's a complex set of signaling transduction pathways that end up determining mating type, that end up determining the physical response to exposure to mating pheromones produced by the yeast. The important thing is that the mating type of a yeast is determined by a particular gene, in this case, the MAT gene. And what can happen is, depending on the environment, if there are no yeast cells nearby of the other mating type, then they can actually change their genotype and switch mating types. So that way they can end up having the option to reproduce sexually if it's needed. And that's usually they'll reproduce sexually when there's some sort of change in the environment. Because that's going to be helpful for them to be able to adapt to that environment. So here you see a population of A-type yeast, and if there are no alpha-type yeast, then some of the yeast cells can switch to an alpha mating type, and then you'll have both mating types in the population. So genetics is complicated, has a lot of environmental factors interacting with it, but next we're going to move on to Unit 6 and talk about the genetic basis of why phenotypes exist based on genotypes.